Van, our work at Strategic Rail Finance has taken a decided turn toward advising economic development entities around the country. And I'm curious for your perspective on what you see as the challenges for economic development staff, executives, leaders to understand more about the role of transportation in their economic development efforts.
Most public officials are familiar with their streets. They understand the interstate or the controlled access highways that go through their community. In many cases, they probably couldn't find their local railroad. Mm-hmm. So we're in a situation in the country where you have a very important element for the future that is not well understood by public officials. Outside of a few specialized transportation planners that you might find at a development district level or COG level, council of government level, there are very few experts that are in the public sector side that understand the rail side of transportation. So you've got that problem that you have to deal with. So you have a big educational gap that needs to be overcome. If you don't understand the system, you probably don't know who the actors are. You probably don't know who your railroad representatives are. You probably don't know which trucking firms are actually rail dependent. You may have the idea, as many people do, that it's a conflict between rail and truck transportation. If I go to one infrastructure, I can't go to the other, much of which is not true because of the integration of the system. So a big challenge is for public planners, urban planners, for the officials they serve and the people in communities to understand how rail is integrated into their community and how can they leverage that for industrial development or economic development. You can't really respond to the needs of a potential prospect to grow in your community if you don't understand what those needs are and you don't understand what the resources you have in place to be able to serve them. So there's a big opportunity, a big educational opportunity. There's a big opportunity and a great need for better coordinated planning, to understand that yes, rail usually runs through the worst parts of your communities in many cases, but in other cases, like Southern California, you have $500,000 houses that are built right up to the rail. How do I use that rail effectively when I have a $500,000 house or $1 million house that's up against it? How do I deal with the NIMBY issues? Rail generates NIMBY issues. These are all poorly understood by the public sector, and I think we have a real opportunity to make communities more effective, to clean up our streets and our roads and our highways from the congestion, because that's the real key public benefit that is immediately recognizable. But in the long run, to create economic development, industrial development in our communities that is going to be sustainable and viable for the foreseeable future.
I have a question for you that gets into the planning perspective. And, you know, in planning you have from the perspective of the public sector, and you have planning from the perspective of the community, and then you have planning from the perspective of the private sector business community that's out to often focused on maximizing their return, minimizing their expense outside of what they see is going to directly benefit their economic fortunes. But railroads and industrial development we see as being very much a land use issue as well as a business issue. We advised an economic development entity that was sponsoring the planning for an intermodal facility. And the main theme of that facility, the main benefit of that facility was to provide a way for the truck traffic from 9 counties in the surrounding region to have a place within the region to bring trucks and containers to get onto the rail system. Now, because the main private sector participant in that project was a major railroad that set up the parameters for the location of that facility, it needed to be right alongside their main line to minimize the time and the effort that it would take to move their trains off of their mainline track into this intermodal facility and get right back on the track. The problem that we saw with that driving requirement was that it took the truck traffic from 9 counties, which was primarily rural, heavy forestry, industry, businesses, and made the trucks drive right into the most densely populated little neighborhoods of this entire 9-county region. So that project made sense from the railroad perspective, but from the perspective of land use planning and quality of community life, it didn't make sense. What, in our view, would have made much more sense would be to locate that intermodal facility 2 or 3 or 4 miles up a branch line of the rail network, so that the trucks could go in and out of a non-residential area, and then you only have a train that's going back to the main line. It would only have brought a little more time and expense to the railroads, and could have accomplished all the goals of this project without having a detrimental impact on the community. The windup of that project was it got squashed by the community right when all the planning had been done and it was time to share the project with the community. They rose up in arms and said, "We don't want this facility." So no one won. How do you see that as a indicative or example of where the railroad industry should be thinking in terms of whole systems development?
Well, that's an excellent question, Michael, because I was talking about the lack of knowledge and, for lack of a better term, the ignorance perhaps of people involved in the public sector regarding it. I would say that for the rail industry as a whole, and particularly for the Class 1 industry, that's largely responsible, the major interstate railroads that are responsible for siting these kinds of facilities, there are really great constraints on where you can put them to some extent. But when you get down to the local area, you've got much more flexibility than perhaps you might recognize, generally speaking. And I would say that when it comes to integrating the rail planning with the urban planning, it's equally weak. That rail planners are largely engineers, largely civil engineers. They're great people. They're transportation engineers. They understand the ebb and flow. They understand the land and the dirt and how you put this together, but they don't understand the fabric of community. So it really, and I'm really glad you brought this up, because I tend to be thinking about the problems that the rail people have with the community more so than the other way around. But this really is, in fact, an issue for the rail industry. I know in our particular case, when I was with the BNSF Railway, we generally avoided, in fact, we were getting intermodal facilities out of major urban areas and locating them on the periphery. And really, in part, I believe I had some effect on that, having spent time with the distribution systems in Atlanta, where you come into the ring interstate around Atlanta, and the stuff that's going into the region all goes out from that ring interstate system, from major regional distribution centers, and the stuff that's penetrating the city goes on into the city. And so that kind of thing can works with rail equally well. So if you look at Logistics Park Chicago, which is one of the first in the country, probably second or third in the country, and one of the most successful, it's 57 miles from the loop. That's a perfect place for it to be. 57 miles from the loop. It did not need to be in the loop. If you look at Logistics Park Kansas City, it's 32 miles from the original yard, it's called Argentine, that was located in Kansas City proper, right down adjacent to the downtown, where rail yards historically were located. It's located some 35 miles to the southwest of it. And so it was an understanding on our part, and I'm kind of lucky. I a master's degree in planning, so I'm trained as an urban and regional planner. So I was able to work with our folks and we were able to understand this. But I would say on the whole, I will not name other Class 1 railroads, but I have seen several examples where if they understood the nature of community development, if they understood the nature of communities in general and the politics of it, they would not have failed. They would have been able to locate their sites. And as it was, they had the same experience that you had. That's not to say that in Kansas City we didn't have resistance from local people. We did. But we had a compelling argument that in the end did prevail, because we did consider those kinds of factors.
Van, thanks so much for coming. And it's great. I've so long I wanted to get us on film, and it's really an honor that you agreed to this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I consider it an honor also. Real pleasure. And I'm excited about the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Van.